At first, the police thought the girl had been hacked to pieces by a sex maniac. But now investigation reveals much more. The terror they are hunting is something less than human, more monster than man. This girl wasn't born. She was assembled piece by piece from living human flesh. The killer took her apart the same way. This is what nightmares are made of. Scream and Scream Again with Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing is the ultimate in horror shock that will make you scream and scream again in color. Rated M.
As the new decade emerged, studios, production heads, and filmmakers alike were all struggling with the same question. What the hell does the youth market want to see? This challenge was especially pronounced in the horror genre. Studios like Hammer Films and Amicus Productions made their bread and butter on the horror of the old-school Gothic variety. Spooky mansions, period costumes, throw in a Dracula or Frankenstein. But as the culture began to shift, audiences were no longer frightened by the same tried-and-true formulas.
It was a time for people and studios and genres to redefine themselves.
Film analyst and author of horror films of the 1970s, John Kenneth Muir.
Are we afraid of the same thing? Well, no, we're afraid of very different things. We're afraid, we're in a war we're losing. We're losing trust in our government. Watergate's only a couple of years away. We're losing faith, actually, in all of these pillars of American society. Fewer people are going to church. Divorce is on the rise. We've got, we now have the birth control pill, which is changing sexuality. And then, we have Roe versus Wade coming up. So, it is a time of incredible change. We've got the hippies, the hippie movement, which then, also sort of mutates into these other movements, like Charles Manson and things like that, like, counterculture becoming, antisocial.
Co-host of the podcast, and now the podcast starts, an exploration of the films of horror icons Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, T.D. Velasquez.
I think the line in The Sun that's always referred to is Night of the Living Dead, which kind of changes the face of what horror in cinema means, really.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're acting like a child.
They're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.
And it certainly took Hammer a long time to work out how to respond to that change. And arguably, they never really worked it out, By about 1973, they were modernizing their productions and trying to tap into the kind of a more contemporary version of horror that was more connected to a young audience. But I don't think that any of the films that they tried to make in that vein are very well regarded or remembered. Oddly enough, Scream and Scream Again was earlier than that and was arguably much more successful in kind of tapping into that vibe, that zeitgeist. But that wasn't Hammer. And even though it technically was made by Amicus, it wasn't really like other Amicus movies either.
Scream and Scream Again promised to satisfy the longtime, die-hard fans of the genre by being the first film to feature the three major icons of horror, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing. More on that later. But it also interjected a political conspiracy, a serial killer, a 15-minute car chase, and many other elements that were believed to be popular with the youth crowds of the time. Many, many other elements.
How would you describe the plot of Scream and Scream Again?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. I think the word that you need is plots there. I think it's got several plots. And the question is, do they all come together in a way that makes sense at the end? I think that's debatable, but there's the nightmarish plot about the runner who finds himself in hospital and every time he wakes up and is visited by the nurse, one of his limbs has gone missing. So he just essentially disintegrates over the course of the film. We keep cutting back to him, and no other characters refer to this plot at all.
Nurse. What's happening? What are they doing? Oh.
Then there's the plot about the character who becomes known as the vampire killer in London. This striking man who stalks nightclubs and lures young women away and attacks them and drinks their blood, hence the name.
Are you going to buy me a drink?
How about coming for a ride?
Not here. It's no good here.
And the police investigation into those killings led by Detective Superintendent Belliver, who's a great character.
She wasn't just murdered, if you know what I mean.
And then we've got the whole storyline of the unnamed Eastern European country in which a character who is possibly called Conrad, or possibly Conrad, depending on which other character says his name, is kind of infiltrating the military establishment and eliminating rivals, torturing dissidents.
Don't worry. You will tell me. You will. You will.
So that's at least 3. Things do tie together, but I'm not sure it's entirely clear how they do. And I think the appeal of the movie is really in how well each of these individual plot lines are presented.
And what of the 3 horror icons who are the big selling points of the film? Peter Cushing plays an Eastern European military official in what amounts to a cameo. He's dispatched of quickly and shares no scenes with Price or Lee.
We have party unity. Those who dissent are eventually converted thanks to people like us and our methods. But military rule is frowned upon these days. We need all the political friends we can get.
Christopher Lee plays a head of British intelligence. He shares one scene with Price, yet the two are only spotted in the same frame together for a few seconds.
Where is Conrad?
He tried to destroy all of this. He thought we'd been careless in letting my work go too far. He was evil. He made me realize that we aren't perfect yet, that we could be corrupted by too much power. So we must find all of the others who may have gone bad and destroy them before it's too late.
It is too late now.
Vincent Price fares the best in terms of screen time. He plays Dr. Browning, an expert in organ and limb transplantation who sets out to create a super race.
It's the old man scientist's dream. Let's play God.
My dear young man, you know as well as I do that God is dying all over the world. Man invented him but doesn't need him anymore. Man is God now. As a matter of fact, he always was.
But where will this end?
Overpopulation, pollution, famine, nuclear holocaust, war. This civilization is driving us into the sea of extinction. The keynote is control.
That's the province of politicians, not scientists.
Yes, but we're the only ones who are trying to combat the problem now. 20 years' time, we will be in positions of power, and then we'll be ready to act for the good of humanity.
The film itself is like a Frankenstein monster, piecing together disparate elements to create something wholly unique. Credit the pairing of director Gordon Hessler and screenwriter Christopher Wicking, a duo who worked together previously on The Oblong Box and would continue a harmonious collaboration over the course of several films in the early 70s.
I actually think it's one of the most intelligent and entertaining British British films of the 1970s. The
curator of the Vincent Price Legacy UK and the Sound of Vincent Price websites, Peter Fuller.
Milton Subotsky, who was running Amicus at the time, they had already done a couple of sci-fi films, The Terranauts and They Came From Outer Space, and he was looking for yet another space story to do, and he happened upon this pulpy novel which is called The Disorientated Man, and he got it, and he looked at it, and I think he bought the rights for about £150 or something, and ended up fashioning a script out of it. And he wanted to do that, but he needed money, so he went to AIP and asked Sam Arkoff about it. But Sam sort of gave it to his right-hand man, who was Deke Hayward. It was in London. He was looking after the European side of AIP. And he said, yep, we'll do it. So they stumped up the money for it, which is like $350,000. But it was on the condition is they had to use the same crew as they were used on the Oblong Box, which included Vincent Price as being the star. And it goes on from there because, unfortunately, when Gordon Hessler was assigned to do the Scream again, he looked at the script and went, oh my God, this is just terrible, because Milton Subotsky had actually really changed it. Now, I have not actually read the draft script of that, or what he actually changed, but Christopher Wicking looked at it and said, oh, do you know what, this is terrible. But he went back to the source novel, and he found that the source novel had a very, very unique structure. And that unique structure plays out in the final, what we see on screen. And that's that disorientated sort of different sets of stories which all come together at the end. You have to go back to the source novel and you realize that Christopher Wicking hasn't really, all he's done is actually, well, you know what, these elements are all really key to what's happening today. Things like fascist regimes taking over, human experimentation on genetic research. And I just think it all tapped into what was happening at the time. But then chuck in a bit of like, a political drama, political thriller, and some car chases, and you've got a great combination, a great fusion.
Wicking never had a collaborator like Gordon Hessler again. He was very fortunate because Gordon Hessler and he saw eye to eye on everything.
Film historian Steve Haberman.
Sometimes he'd come up with ideas for shots, like Wicking came up with the idea of that spectacular shot in Scream and Scream Again, where you first see Alfred Marks as the superintendent of police. And it's just the most amazing shot because, first of all, it's shot at sundown, it looks like. And he's walking along with this dead girl, and he's being followed by other police and reporters who are noting down what he's saying. And the camera is tracking along with him as he walks away from the body and toward his car. And he's talking the whole time, and the camera just keeps moving, obviously on a crane. And then he gets in the car, and the car pulls off onto the road and drives back into the background as the sun seems to be going down. I mean, it's the most amazing shot. That was Christopher Wicking's idea. He said, what if we did this in one shot? And Gordon Hessler said, let's do that. Gordon Hessler was a middle-aged man, and Christopher Wicking was in his 20s. And Gordon Hessler was a very quiet guy, very almost passive-seeming guy, but very strong in his beliefs. And what Christopher Wicking did, I think, was he unleashed the leftist in Gordon Hessler. And so these movies are all very, very sort of secular illustrations of the theme of sin and retribution, in which the sin is committed by an older generation. And it's usually on the current generation, the youngest generation. In other words, the older generation is exploiting youth for their own selfish reasons or to hide their past or for whatever reason that the narrative gives them. But it's very consistent that way. And they consciously made them these works of counterculture, set in a Gothic past, in all cases except Scream and Scream Again, which was kind of set in a weird science fiction-y present, And Wicking said that, to deal with real things naturalistically is boring. He says that's what British cinema has always done, sort of the kitchen sink school of cinema. He said it's much, much more creatively inspiring to deal with these things metaphorically in a fantasy context. Like The Oblong Box, Christopher Wicking wrote as a protest against colonialism, British colonialism, and its exploitation of indigenous peoples. And it's brilliant in that. And Scream and Scream Again is about how progressivism can destroy itself by going too far. Not that we don't need a revolution, we just don't need this revolution where you're using the body parts of the young to create, an army of protest to take the world away from the corrupt older generation. Christopher Wicking was quite an intellectual screenwriter. He was extremely well versed in film history and aesthetics, not to mention current affairs and other artistic movements. He was a very kind of erudite guy. And Gordon Hessler was an extremely skillful and kind of avant-garde director. Even though he had worked for Hitchcock for all these decades, he also embraced, handheld camera and wide-angle lenses and, extreme moving shots. And, he was like pushing the boundaries of narrative filmmaking in the very commercial realm of AIP horror films.
I mean, I still find that it's got the mix of sci-fi, crime procedural drama, and political thriller. And I think that's a fusion that comes together, which is quite unique.
It was on a dark street in a respectable suburban neighborhood that the Thing first made its presence known. See Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing, three masters of the macabre in Scream and Scream Again.